Thanks, everybody. We're so glad to see you join us this Thursday. The conversation that we had last week on grief and loss was a good conversation, but there's so much more to go after in that regard. We had to really enjoy being able to discuss some things with the Jennings and the Andresians. Our friend Mark Philbrick is an expert here. He's got so much to offer in the area of grief and loss. And so Mark is the director of education at Transitions Hospice out in North Carolina, and is leads a grief share support group. Grief Share is a national organization, a faith-based organization that has about 500 groups across the country, and he leads one there locally. So Mark, welcome. We are so glad that you could be here with us this evening and help us to unpack a little more about grief and loss.
Well, thank you, Joseph. I want to say up front, I don't claim myself to be an expert on grief. I don't know if I could ever claim that. I've been doing hospice work for 14 years, and I can remember coming back home on my 4-year anniversary at hospice and telling my wife at the time, I had been working there 4 years, and she said, "Are you sick of it yet?" Because after about every 3 years, I would change my clinical specialty. I've been a registered nurse for 44 years. And I said at 4 years, I felt I was just scratching the surface. And I'm entering my 14th year, and I think I'm just below the epidermis, the first layer of this. It is so deep, and I just realized, and I have my background here is actually the Rift Valley in Kenya. This was taken when in 2004, I made a trip with a couple of guys from church to go to Kenya and to South Africa and do some medical missionary work. And when I was there, one of the things we did was lead a grief support group for women in the slums of Kenya who had discovered that their children had AIDS from husbands that had been unfaithful. And it was obviously a very moving experience. And currently there's about 20 million AIDS orphans in Africa. So we think about grief on our scale, and it's everywhere. And but as we said last time, we can't compare. Everyone's loss is their own loss, and every loss is significant in its own way. And grief, can all seem like so overwhelming that it is a natural response to loss. And we often think of loss of being that as a loved one, because that's such a dramatic and significant loss. But losses come in so many ways, as we're seeing in this situation we're in now. People losing bodily function, losing body image when they have amputations or some type of disfiguring accident, loss of just control over their lives, loss of their freedom of mobility, freedom to have access to their loved ones. 2 weekends ago, my sister-in-law's father died of COVID up in Massachusetts. He had bumped his head 5 weeks ago and ended up in a rehab center. The day after that, they went on lockdown, and she had not seen her father in 5 weeks. They called her on a Thursday that he had a fever, tested positive, and Saturday morning they found him dead in his bed, and she wasn't able to be there with him. So many people are going through that type of loss. So loss of health, loss of identity as people's roles change. The unemployment I saw today, 36 million people now in our country are unemployed. So the loss of financial stability, the loss of, as we were talking, as we were praying, all these high school students and college students, loss of an anticipated future of people who were anticipating a marriage or a graduation, all of those things. A loss of innocence, as we begin to see a world is not what we thought it was going to be. A loss of relationships, loss of property. There'll be millions of people who are having to declare bankruptcy because of the financial situations they're in. A loss of religious belief. faith that God is in control or not in control, or everything's out of control. The perceptions that we see that have been overwhelming, the loss of safety and stability, the loss of significant people and treasured objects, people having to sell property in order to just put food on the table. So loss hits us in so many different ways. The other thing is that loss can come in so many different ways. We can experience sudden loss. We know that there are people who've lost loved ones suddenly and tragically. It can come through gradual loss, as people have seen somebody suffer from Alzheimer's or Lou Gehrig's disease for years. They've seen that person dwindling away, and that loss can be staggering as well. We see violent loss, where people have lost loved ones to violent accidents or shootings or stabbings or just random acts of violence. And another type of loss that it can come is through neglect. We see, neglect where people just have been abused. The other thing is that we can also experience loss either gradually, suddenly, or what we call disenfranchised loss. That's when people say, oh, it was no big deal. In fact, it was interesting. I was doing a purchase of something from a gentleman a couple of days ago, and I had my mask on. He said, oh, you believe in all this? He said, this scam that everyone's trying to, and I said, well, I happen to have my sister-in-law's dad just died of the COVID virus. The guy said, well, he was old anyways. And then he proceeded to tell me that he was selling his stuff because he needed to move to Nashville to get a heart transplant at Vanderbilt Medical Center. This was a retired Marine. And I'm thinking, why would you waste your time getting a heart? Why not give it to someone who isn't old? I mean, it's just the irony of how people can discredit somebody's loss is, hey, they were going to die anyways. Nobody's ever ready for that. The other thing that we see as disenfranchised loss is loss of pets, loss of things that people say, well, it was just a dog. In many people's lives, the loss of a pet can be even more significant than a loss of as a family member, because in some families, that pet was the only thing they ever experienced unconditional love from. So, it can be all over the place. And the other part of grief is it affects every aspect of our lives. It affects us physically. If you've ever gone through, and all of us have gone through some type of loss and grief, some people try to medicate it through eating more or drinking more or drugs, try to deaden the pain. There are other people that it affects mentally and emotionally, that they walk around like they feel they're in a fog. Some people can't sleep. Some people, all they can do is sleep. So part of this is thinking of the metaphor of what your loss is like, and no two will be exactly the same. And to allow people to feel their loss. It's something we know you can't, people say, well, you just need to get over it. There is no getting over it. The other thing I realized is the background. I was there in 2004 in Kenya. And in January, I believe I was out with Michael and Scott Stankavage, and a group of us were out at the boot camp, John Eldridge's boot camp, Wild at Heart. And that's where I began connecting from my head to my heart how to deal with a lot of the things I had dealt with in life. And it happened that after that very event, I went to Kenya and experienced seeing loss in a massive scale. But then that fall, I lost my job. 3 days later, my dad moved into my home because he was dying of terminal cancer. And that began my journey into hospice. I cared for him for 3 months. At the time, my wife was separated from me. We went through some horrific things. She had a relationship with a guy that she had spent over $50,000 on in 10 months. I had to sell my home to pay my debts. A week after my dad died, my brother went into hospice. 55-year-old professional golfer with a wife and 3 kids left behind. He lasted 2 months after my dad. I lost my job. I lost my home. I lost my family members. So it was like one loss after another. So another thing is that loss can be cumulative. And that's some of what we're going to talk about tonight, is all of these things we're experiencing, even if they don't seem significant, can have a significant cumulative effect. And as we teach grief and loss, we talk about it, how it affects the mind, it affects the body, it affects the emotions, and it affects your spirit. And it hit me when we were teaching one of these classes that, you know, God is the cure for all that. We're commanded to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. All 4 dimensions that are impacted by grief and loss is how we can connect to our grief and loss, and having God sort of re-put in perspective, what we call eventually integrating into a new normal, realizing it's never going to be the same. Similar to somebody who has an amputation. Somebody gets a leg amputated, they're going to have acute pain from that surgery. Even as the surgery heals and that stump begins to heal, they can't walk the way they used to. Now, eventually, they'll be fitted with a prosthesis. And some people will have phantom pain for months. Even though that leg's no longer there, they'll feel pain. Same with grief. That pain will continue. And even when they readjust and begin to walk with a prosthesis, they'll never have that leg back, and they'll never have the same gait. So they say you can lose a person's life, but you never lose that relationship. That relationship continues as we walk with that person in our heart. That can't be taken away. But eventually we have the opportunity to integrate back into a realistic view of how we're going to move forward. And it's not easy. It's a tangled ball of emotions. You can't get over it. You can't get under it. You can't get around it. You have to go through that pain and that journey, and that takes time, and sharing your heart and your honesty with other people, and not letting anyone tell you to get over it or you ought to be over it by now. My mother died when I was 21. She was my best friend, and every Mother's Day, I still feel that pain, and I will till the last day I live on this planet. That you don't get over that. You get through it, and you learn from it. So don't want anyone to minimize whatever they're going through, but have an opportunity to share with each other how it's affecting you, how it's affecting you physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And knowing that in the book of Isaiah, they refer to Jesus, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. Even though he knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, he wept for him when he saw Mary and Martha's mourning. That mourning is an outward sign of grief. And he was somebody who felt the pain, even though he knew that it wasn't forever, even though he knows there's a resurrection. It still hurts. So there's no easy fix to this, but there are resources. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. And so you have an opportunity to reach out and get some support. There's a book that when I was going through my grief support, when I decided I wanted to be a hospice nurse, I was told I had to go through 6 months of grief work before I could be hired, because they knew that, just like they tell you on the airplane, if a mask descends from the ceiling because of loss of cabin pressure, put on your own oxygen mask first before you try to help the person next to you. So some of this is going through grief work and grief understanding. And one of the books I had to read as part of my assignment was C.S. Lewis's book, which was his journal about the loss of his life, of his wife to cancer, called A Grief Observed. And I'll tell you, I had to chew that in some bite-sized pieces. That was not a light read for me, but it was his honest pain and his questioning God about the loss of his wife, the love of his life. So even what we would consider spiritual giants struggle with this. So there's no quick fixes. And it's something that's common to all of us, and even common to God. He grieves for us, and he understands our grief and our sorrow. And like Forrest Gump, that's all I have to say about that.
Mark, thank you. That's some good stuff. And I got to tell you, the cumulative component of what you said is compounding pretty heavily with me. And then just before you begin to talk, that passage in First John, not First John, but in John chapter 11, where Jesus, was going to raise Lazarus. He knew the glory that was about to come, but he's still experiencing the pain of those around him. The emotions, depends on the version that you read. It's overcome with emotion or a deep anger welled within him. And when the message says that, that's what I felt through a lot of the sorrow of the loss that we've experienced this year. But last night I was sitting at the fire with Lori after we returned from her grandmother's funeral, and the grief turned to sadness, and it's been the anger, turned to sadness. So I'll let Lori talk more about the cumulative effect, or how this is hitting. How's this hitting you, dear?
Well, I think I'm really having to process a lot of how do I handle grief. I really appreciate, Mark, what you said about you have to feel it. We have to sit in it. And that's been really hard for me. I shared last week that I typically turn to busyness, and you see how different people handle grief, and there's lots of different forms. There's busyness and there's control. Let's control everything from when we set out the food to when we put up the food to where the chairs go to, there's this grapple for control or resignation or avoidance. And I'm really trying to process through how I have grieved or not grieved, and to really allow myself to feel the grief from loss, and that's okay. And I think it's important for each of us to really ask ourselves, how were we brought up to feel loss and grief? Were we allowed to do that, or allowed to share our emotions about that? And so where might some of these feelings come from? And so I'm really kind of sitting in that and trying to evaluate that within myself, and also just allow myself to feel it. It's been beautiful. I went through, I have my grandmother's Bible, and I went through last night and was just looking to see all the things that she kept, all the things that were important. And she had 8 grandkids. I'm the oldest of 8. And I found where she had drawn my hands and my feet and put my name in the date. And I found where she kept an article. I have an uncle who's blind, and she kept an article about, how does it feel to be blind? She was trying to connect to what someone else is feeling. And I just think that there's something so rich for us in that, to try to connect with someone else in their grief. And so I think that's one of the things that I can learn from this. I think when we feel these things or experience these things, it gives us a platform to be able to be there for somebody else, and to be able to know how to be there for somebody else, the things that work and the things that don't. We talked last week, Scott talked about the Brene Brown, the sympathy versus empathy. And empathy does not mean, well, at least you still have this, or, well, at least this. And I think so many of us have experienced that diminishment of our loss from those who are well-meaning, or, close friends or family. And it's hard. And so if nothing else, I'm learning that God will meet me wherever my emotions are. And that can be the anger that Joseph was talking about. I mean, we all experience that at the loss, just the sadness, the retreat, the control, whatever it is, He's big enough to meet us there and will do that patiently and kindly. And an example of how he's done that in my life, we had a good friend that was 31, passed away with metastatic breast cancer, and we watched her struggle and suffer there at the end. And it was so difficult. And we prayed over her and prayed for a miracle, and, you know, faith of a mustard seed, right? And I think that's where we get in this quandary too, of somebody praying for her had the faith of a mustard seed. And so I've struggled with doubt and questioning God, and, you know, why are you doing it this way? And why aren't you intervening? And, you know, I was in the shower because, you know, it's one of the only places when you have a lot of kids that you can get peace. And I was scrubbing my head really hard, you know, just mad at God, just talking to him about how I felt about it and kind of railing at him. And he so kindly spoke to me and gave me one of those God downloads about how her healing is complete. And it was just the most beautiful, here I am in my anger, and he speaks to me there. And so he's continued to do that and will continue to do that. And he gives us the gift of his voice of other people. And I'm so grateful for that, and so grateful for the gift of beauty and the feelings that he's given us and the support that he's put around me in Joseph, and in the support in the Zoweh group, and just how they have lifted us up. And what a gift it is to be lifted up in prayer by people who can hold the weight and shoulder the load for you. So thank you for your words, Mark.
Yeah, it did remind me of, you know, in the book of Job, where he lost literally everything overnight: his family, his property, his possessions, his health. And he had his 3 friends come to him. And it says that he was there in sackcloth and ashes sitting. And for a week, they just sat with him in silence. And just their presence was what he needed. Once they opened their mouth, that's when the trouble began. And the point of that whole story is there's nothing we can really say to somebody to fix their grief. It's us being present with them is what, you know, we're really just called to do. Sometimes it's just being, because doing is never enough.
That's so good. I saw a post from Lisa Turkhurst, and she says, God often works in the unseen. Just because we can't see it or feel it, it doesn't mean that he's doing nothing. And she also says, don't take what feels like a lack of intervention as a sign of his lack of affection. Look for ways that God is showing you assurances of his love. His deep affection is all around you. And that was so encouraging to me. And I hear that in the things that you're saying, Mark, as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.
Yeah, friends, we want to really give everyone a time to spend in the breakout rooms this time and have some time to process with a couple of questions that Mark has given us. The questions that we have, and we'll go into, I'll post these in the chat in just a second, are: what type of losses have you experienced this year? And what effect have these had on you physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually? How have you been dealing with all of this? And what are you learning from all of this? What we decided is that I do better at pushing buttons and Lori does better at the talking. So I'll let Lori and Mark.
We didn't decide that.
No, that was a conversation we were just kind of teasing about. But we'll let Lori and Mark share some final thoughts, and then I'll offer the resources and pray us out.
So something else that has really been stirring in my heart, and we talked about in our breakout session, is hope deferred makes the heart sick. And so I think the effect of cumulative loss it's really deferred my hope. And I think in so many ways we become sad and we doubt God's goodness. We doubt God's intervention. We doubt God's love in that. And again, he can meet us there. The full verse says, hope deferred makes the heart sick, but when desire is fulfilled, it is a tree of life. And that's Proverbs 13:12. And so I think that desire, that's our kingdom heart. We long for the coming kingdom. We long for all things to be made new and to be made right, to be made just and fair, when there's no more sickness and no more death, and we can be together and around the table. And that longing is very present right now in our family and with me. And I think many of us are feeling that groaning. I think the earth is feeling that groaning. We're seeing it, the earthquakes and the natural disasters. Creation is crying out. And we're calling for Jesus to come, praying for Jesus to come. So I think that's our kingdom heart, and he will make all things new. And so I'm excited about that, and I'm ready for that.
Mark, let me get you unmuted, buddy.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's two resources online that I think are useful that you can get free information from. One is griefshare.org. Griefshare.org is a Christian-based organization that has support groups. They're free. Typically, they last 10 to 13 weeks, hour and a half a week. Many of them obviously have gone virtual now, and they do have some good resources online. The other is our own organization. I work with Transitions Life Care in Raleigh. We're a large hospice and palliative care organization. We care for about 1,900 terminally ill patients a day now. We have a staff of 580 professionals, but we do have a grief center with 7 full-time master's prepared grief counselors. And if you go to transitionslifecare.org and click on the grief center, there's some great reference materials. There's also for children and teenagers, or parents of children and teenagers, if they're experiencing loss in their family, it helps their video clips, typically 3 to 5 minutes long, on different aspects of how to explain death and grief and loss to children and teens, as well as reference lists of books and materials for children who are experiencing grief, adolescents going through it, and then adult materials. And we have adult material references for people who've lost a parent, who've lost a child, have lost a spouse, have lost a sibling. So there's all sorts of great resources. And we do offer free support counseling. This is all provided. We're a private, not-for-profit, and we have people that provide gifts and donations to us to be able to provide these services free of charge. So I strongly recommend going to griefshare.org or transitionslifecare.org to get more free resources on this.
Thanks, Mark. In addition to those 2 resources, all of these I've posted in the chat for you guys too. You can copy from there if you'd like. And the survival kit that we have, it's zoweh.org/survival-kit. Still have some great resources available for you there for free from Zoweh. Our Exploring More podcast, these Thursday night recordings have been recorded and are there. This week, actually, we dropped the conversation between Michael Thompson and John Eldridge and SJ on overcoming the unexpected in a season like this. And so that's a good podcast you'll want to get put on your short list to get to. You can email us at support@zoweh.org. Another great thing, and this has been so good for my heart this past week, is just the 1-minute pause app. The reminders, I've needed them. The Ransomed Heart 1-minute pause app, which is kind of released by Ransomed Heart in tandem with John's new book, Get Your Life Back, which is available on Amazon. And the video that we pasted last week is a good one. If you didn't get a chance to watch that, get a chance to watch that. Brene Brown on empathy. Such a good video of what Mark was sharing. This Job's friends just came and sat with him. That's a great video. So if you guys will just hang with 1 more minute, I'll pray us out. And we just thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been a really good evening of conversation and stepping into a difficult topic of grief. And Mark, we really, really greatly appreciate you joining us and sharing your great experience. And really good. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Father, Jesus, Holy Spirit, we just thank you so much for good hearts, for loving hearts like Mark. And thank you for all of our friends here that have joined us this evening. I pray for those that will hear this recording later as well, for their hearts and for the discussions that have been had today and will be had tomorrow and the days to come. The loss that's been experienced of the past, the loss that will come, new losses and old losses, and the accumulation of it all. Jesus, we invite you into it, into all of the emotions, from sadness to anger and everything in between. Jesus, we know that you have experienced all of those emotions as well. And it's through our experience in suffering that we get to experience you. So I pray that in all of this, that we would do just that, be able to lift up our heads, and that this hope that is deferred in times like this, that the desires of our hearts will be made known and true to you, and that you would guide our steps through this, not around it, not dismiss it, but through the grief, through the pain, to feel what you have for us to feel in it, knowing that you full well have felt it first, and that you want to meet us there. So we invite you, Jesus, into the pain, invite you into all of the stories of those who are with us tonight, and those who will listen in the days to come. Jesus, we thank you for your love and for your sacrifice, and for your death. And it's through your death that we get to experience the power of your resurrection. And so that's what I pray over all of our friends and allies, is the power of your resurrection and the river of life to come in to all of the suffering and all the pain and all of the grief and all of the loss, that we would come to experience and know the life and the power of your resurrection in all of it. Jesus, in your holy name, we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, friends. Thank you for joining us.